On one hand, there is the Bible, a spiritual guide for millions of the faithful, many of whom believe it to be the Word of God divinely revealed. And on the other hand, there is Hollywood, the heart of the entertainment industry. Less a place than a state of mind, it is hoopla and hucksterism, aspiring to great art while grasping at the almighty buck. Widely regarded as materialistic, vainglorious, hedonistic, even sinful and decadent, Hollywood is viewed as the home to all sorts of vice, from adultery to the worship of graven images. No wonder some think it a modern Babylon. The union of Hollywood and the Bible may seem to some like a marriage made somewhere other than heaven. But if Hollywood and the Bible make for an odd couple, some of their progeny have proven to be magnificent spectacles and moving dramas.
Who shall withstand the power of God?
I've only really done 2 biblical films. 10 Commandments, of course, and Greatest Story Ever Told, in which I played the relatively short role, though very good one, of John the Baptist.
Listen to the voice of one crying in the wilderness.
Some films derived from the Bible can be admired by both movie audiences and the faithful. A few have become classics that continue to awe and inspire to this day.
Behold his mighty hand.
The Bible has inspired many people over the centuries, but when it inspires movies, the results have been mixed. Hollywood treads on dangerous ground whenever it tries to depict events from the good book. Films have treated subjects from the Bible with reverence and with irreverence.
The Lord Jehovah has given unto you these 10 commandments.
Many people have an easier time remembering stories from the Bible rather than its teachings. So it is no wonder that much of the Bible teaches through stories. And if Hollywood excels at anything, it is the telling of stories. From the beginnings of cinema, movie makers have looked to the Bible for inspiration. Not spiritual, but searching for good plots that can be presented on the screen. One reason had a lot of appeal to movie studios. The Bible is in the public domain, and no royalties had to be paid to the author.
Moses' life is one of the greatest adventure stories ever put between the covers of a book.
Biblical stories also had a certain sense of respectability movie makers crave. But having one eye on the box office and the other on reverential treatment of a biblical subject often left them cross-eyed. So filmmakers focused on commercial success rather than strict adherence to the source material. After all, screenwriters and directors had no qualms about altering literary classics and even rewriting history to fit the needs of the movie scripts. They sought to improve stories from the Bible by fleshing out plot lines, adding or subtracting characters, or even changing the events described in the Bible to better suit the dramatic narrative or box office appeal. Battle scenes are a sure crowd pleaser. Filmmakers love to show marching troops, cavalry charging at full tilt, and clashing swords to break up the monotony of ponderous sermonizing. When the going gets a little dull, Hollywood also has a tendency to bring on the dancing girls to liven things up. Sometimes even that doesn't help.
Who's the one who wails like a she-wolf baying at the moon?
Ironically, tales of sex, violence, torture, adultery, and murder, all the elements religious groups denounce in movies, often come directly from the Bible itself. If Bible purists were disappointed or even outraged, the movie industry rarely cared.
Action!
Hollywood has always been more concerned about selling tickets than saving souls. Moreover, people go to the movies to be entertained, and audiences tend to resent it when films get, well, preachy. Perhaps the filmmaker most associated with biblical epics is Cecil B. DeMille.
We generally think of Moses either as the prophet with the long white beard, or
the son of an Episcopalian lay preacher and an Englishwoman of Jewish descent. He was both a devout Christian and a master showman, telling his morality tales in mammoth movie spectaculars.
Mount Sinai.
DeMille, who, among other things, was one of the guys that invented the movies in the first place, which gives me a curious historical connection to the very beginning of the medium. He made the first feature film ever made in Hollywood.
Themes of faith and religious redemption frequently appeared even in DeMille's early movies. However, DeMille made sure to show plenty of sin before redemption came around. Those who worked for him knew him as a tyrannical perfectionist.
That girl doing over there with a 1935 headdress? You know, this isn't a fantasy, this is history. Are you ready, Tate?
Already and turning, Mr. DeMille.
All right, now, give me everything you've got, you people.
He was kind of demanding, you know. Just, don't forget you guys are getting paid or something like that. He'd holler down with the microphone, you know. Let's see you act now.
You townspeople over beyond the gate there, don't be extras. Be a nation.
He wanted the whole crowd to be, which I don't blame him, because the pictures cost a ton of money, and he had to answer to the stockbrokers.
C.B. DeMille was a strange kind of a very powerful man, and he worked long hours, and he knew what he was doing, and if he liked you, boy, he liked you.
Although DeMille made different kinds of films, he's best remembered for his epics.
He was one of you guys that had his name above the title, Cecil B. DeMille's 10 Commandments.
But it was the Italians who invented the film epic, grandiose movies shot on a massive scale during the early years of motion pictures. In movies such as The Last Days of Pompeii, made in 1913, and Cabiria, made in 1914, Italian filmmakers presented cinema spectaculars on a scale that Hollywood would emulate. Over the years, there would be rivalry between American filmmakers and the Italians, and frequently collaborations. One such teaming attempted to make a series of epic films based on the entire Old Testament. In the early 1960s, Italian producer Dino De Laurentiis and American director John Huston combined on this ambitious undertaking. Accomplished English playwright Christopher Fry adapted the screenplay, aided of course by the original text.
And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light.
But the project proved simply too colossal, so after more than 20 hours of film were compiled, they stopped filming. they settled down to telling only Genesis and left the rest of the Old Testament for later. The result was the Bible in the beginning. It covered Genesis from the creation of the world to the story of Abraham and Isaac. The story of Adam and Eve is told with Michael Parks and Ulla Bergrid. They played out the events that lead up to the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. Also told is the tale of Cain and Abel, with Richard Harris as Cain. This was followed by the story of Noah and the flood. Director John Huston played both Noah and the voice of God. Of course, all directors think they speak with the voice of God. Also depicted were the Tower of Babel and the confusion of languages. Stephen Boyd played the arrogant ruler building the tower. Peter O'Toole appeared as all three angels on their mission to the sinful and doomed cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. George C. Scott had the role of the patriarch Abraham, with Ava Gardner as Sarah. The production was simply too big and overblown. The Bible in the beginning proved a dead end. It lost millions, and no sequels were forthcoming. Most productions are content to focus on only one or two stories from the Bible. One of the most familiar tales is that of Adam and Eve. To avoid censorship problems and scandalizing the prudish, Adam and Eve often required more foliage than fig leaves can provide. Hence, movie Eves tend to wear their hair long and strategically placed over their chests. But occasionally, nudity was the main selling point. Some films clothed themselves in biblical respectability while being essentially exploitational. The 1958 Mexican film Adam and Eve told the story of the creation of Adam from the earth and Eve being cloned from Adam's rib. Carlos Baña played Adam, with Christiane Martel as Eve. Her casting seems to have been related to her being a former Miss Universe. They play out the tale of temptation and regret in their movie studio Garden of Eden. But the expulsion banished them into going on location in the Mexican desert. The 1972 film The Sin of Adam and Eve was a bit more exploitational than most. It presented Jorge Rivero playing Adam as a kind of Tarzan, battling the beasts of the wild.
Taste the forbidden fruit.
It also had Candy Wilson as a particularly sexy Eve. No problem here with going forth and multiplying. Having succumbed to temptation, Adam and Eve soon received their eviction notice.
Adam and Eve.
Often the tale of their downfall ends up played for laughs. The private lives of Adam and Eve had the same actors playing dual roles in two stories, one set in the Garden of Eden and the other in modern times.
Now, no sense getting excited just because my husband's running away with your wife.
Mickey Rooney played the devil, with Mamie Van Doren as a rather buxom Eve, requiring more hair than usual for camouflage.
Why shouldn't we eat it? Looks all right to me.
You said a mouthful, kid.
Who are you?
Me? I'm a snake.
The technique of parallel stories, one contemporary and one set in ancient times, dates back to the silent era, pioneered by directors such as D.W. Griffith and Cecil B. DeMille. It was used in the 1928 movie Noah's Ark, directed by Michael Curtiz. Filmed from a screenplay by Darryl Zanuck, future Hollywood mogul, it told the tale of Noah and the Great Flood, as well as presented a modern-day story of Europe about to be engulfed by the First World War. Actors played parallel roles in both the ancient and modern settings. The modern story paled in contrast to the spectacular depiction of Noah's world destroyed by God's watery wrath. The movie went to great lengths to make this wrath justifiable. The scene of the flood proved a little too realistic, as several extras drowned when studio technicians were unable to control the force of the water pouring onto the set. Despite the tragic accident, Noah's Ark proved a big box office success. Originally a silent film, it was reissued with music and sound effects. This version would be occasionally reissued as a true Hollywood epic. The 1962 international co-production Sodom and Gomorrah depicted the fiery end of the twin cities of vice. Naturally, it showed all the vice to audiences who might otherwise not be convinced God's wrath was justified. At least whatever vice could get past the wrath of the censors. Robert Aldrich and Sergio Leone shared the directing credits on Sodom and Gomorrah. Presumably one directed Sodom and the other Gomorrah. While the book of Genesis covers many characters during different eras, the second book of the Bible, Exodus, focuses on one central character, that of Moses. It was on this subject Cecil B. DeMille first forayed into biblical cinema with the Ten Commandments made in 1923. It actually came about as a result of a publicity contest in which Paramount Studios offered a reward for a good idea for a movie. The winning suggestion was a movie about the Ten Commandments. Clamoring to make a big-scale epic, DeMille leaped on the suggestion and had his screenwriter Jeannie McPherson forge a tale from the book of Exodus. DeMille made massive Egyptian sets populated by the soon-to-be traditional cast of thousands. Only the first part of the movie dealt with Exodus. The rest of the picture took place in the modern era, with the main characters suffering the consequences of breaking various commandments. But it was the early scenes of Exodus which wowed audiences in 1923. Many sequences were filmed in an early color process. This expense was another reason production costs soared. DeMille's bosses at Paramount feuded with him over the expenditure of such sums on so risky a film. But DeMille persisted, even offering to buy the film and distribute it himself. DeMille used the best special effects available for the show-stopping parting of the Red Sea. It left audiences of the day gasping in amazement. The Ten Commandments proved a tremendous box office success. By the early 50s, DeMille was the most famous filmmaker in Hollywood. At the age of 74, he could have rested on his laurels, but instead he set out to make his most ambitious film, a new sound version of the Ten Commandments. For his mammoth 1956 remake, DeMille threw out the modern story of the 1923 version and concentrated only on the book of Exodus. He had a lot of research done on the Bible and Egyptian history, even if he often ignored the results.
Moses. If you will be patient with me, I'd like to talk to you about this wonderful soul that Michelangelo caught so magnificently in marble. For centuries, people have been puzzled by these horns. Well, in the original book of Exodus, the Hebrew text tells us that when Moses came down from the mount, Keren came from his head. Well, Keren is the Hebrew word for horn, but it also is the Hebrew word for rays of light. Later artists, like Doré, show Moses with rays of light coming from his head.
DeMille cast Charlton Heston in the role of Moses, partly because he had worked with him before on another movie, but also because Heston bore a striking resemblance to Michelangelo's Moses. Heston's Moses would feature neither horns nor rays of light coming out of his head.
I had a fine time. He was very easy on actors, really. He could be very tough with ADs and prop men and wardrobe people and makeup people. If an actress showed up late in the set, which he really knew very well was her fault, he wouldn't rebuke her because that would just upset her. But in front of her, he would castigate the hairdressers, the wardrobe people, the makeup people, and say, "You have kept Miss Hutton, Miss Baxter, waiting, kept us waiting for her for nearly half an hour past her call. I can't tolerate it. I won't tolerate it. You must not do this again." And they would bow their heads, and the actress involved would know perfectly well that it was she that had kept them waiting.
The Bible omits the first 30 years or so that brought Moses to manhood. To fill in those missing years, we turn to ancient historians, such as Philo and Josephus. Philo wrote during the lifetime of Jesus of Nazareth, and Josephus wrote some 50 years later. These historians had access to documents long since destroyed, or perhaps lost, like the Dead Sea Scrolls. Moses grew to manhood and power, a prince of Egypt. When Moses learned that he was Hebrew, and he looked upon the sufferings of his own people, the Bible tells us Moses killed.
Yul Brynner sternly played the Pharaoh Ramses. Edward G. Robinson had the thankless role of the conniving traitor Dathan, but he was thankful. DeMille hired Robinson despite his being blacklisted by Hollywood during the Red Scare.
If what you say pleases me, I will give you your price, all of it. If not, I will give you the point of this blade through your lying throat. Agreed?
Agreed.
DeMille pulled out all stops for what would be his last picture. He set off for Egypt, determined to film on the historic locations along the Nile and in the Sinai Desert. Mammoth sets were built on a scale the pharaohs would have appreciated, which were soon populated by the now traditional cast of thousands. Some of ancient Egypt appeared as ancient Egypt, when authentic ruins were also used as sets. Local Egyptians were rounded up to play the Hebrews for the Exodus scene. They did not need costumes, for their everyday clothes were hardly different from those of ancient times. Soldiers from the modern Egyptian army also supplemented the great mass of people.
4,000 Hebrews in the scene were being played by members of the Egyptian army, which is pretty funny.
Poets, strike your bows.
The script was typical DeMille camp, and the production on the gaudy side, but all the actors took their roles seriously. None more than Heston himself, who immersed himself into the role of Moses, memorizing whole sections of Exodus.
If there is one more plague on Egypt, it is by your word that God will bring it. And there shall be so great a cry throughout the land that you will surely let the people go. Come to me no more, Moses. For on the day you see my face again, you will surely die.
Midway through the production, DeMille suffered a near-fatal heart attack. Doctors advised him to abandon the picture or he would surely die, but steadfast as Moses, he pressed on.
Go out from among us, you and your people. I set you free.
Elmer Bernstein wrote the score under DeMille's guiding hand.
The actual look of the Exodus is very slow. I mean, they blow the ram's horns and the people move off to a very slow kind of rhythm. So I wrote a kind of very slow, kind of felt like a march, a slow march, with sort of Hebraic overtones, you know, because after all, they were Hebrews. And Cecil B. DeMille, who was he was really shrewd and really knew music really well. He hated it. He said, he didn't like that at all. I said, what is the problem? Well, he said, it's too slow. It's too slow, and it brings the whole feeling down. I said, well, I was just trying to mirror, you know, what the pace of the people. So he said, no, he said, trust me, the type of thing he wanted to hear, he said something like, "Onward, Christian soldiers." So it was very funny. It was all very ecumenical, because here you had, 4,000 Hebrews being played by Arabs marching off to "Onward, Christian soldiers."
I was hired by Cecil B. DeMille just to have a little tiny part, and I was in a wagon with a little lamb. Then all of a sudden I hear this great big voice boom out, "Don't let that little girl's face get in the camera." I thought, oh, I'm sorry, what did I do? But in actuality, he had in mind to write new scenes for me in Ten Commandments.
Death to the slaves!
For the pursuit by Pharaoh, DeMille had Egyptian cavalrymen trained for 6 months, learning how to drive chariots.
I did a lot of scenes with Charlton Heston as the Red Sea is parting. So that was kind of my really baptism by water into the business.
Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you took us away to die in the wilderness?
Behold his mighty hand!
Cecil B. DeMille was great, and as a child too, I remember he would go up on a big crane, so he was almost really like the voice of God, because you would look up and you see this figure on this immense crane overlooking, all of the people, and then the voice booming forth, and you say, whoa, maybe that is God.
To film the Ten Commandments, we rolled our cameras on the very ground that Moses walked. Here from the land of Goshen, across the Red Sea, down through the deserts of Shur and Sin, to Mount Sinai, the holy place of God.
Our trip to Mount Sinai was more than a motion picture making expedition. It was the climax of a great spiritual experience for all of us who had a part in, shall I say, this crusade. For no one could stand in the shadow of this holy mountain and not feel the impact of God's gift to the world of man, the Ten Commandments, the law that will stand indestructible when the graven idols of the pharaohs are crumbled into dust.
At the time of its release, the Ten Commandments became one of the biggest moneymakers in the history of Hollywood, second only to Gone with the Wind. It was nominated for several Academy Awards, including Best Picture, but lost out to Around the World in 80 Days. But it remains a testament to one man's vision, his faith, and his showmanship.
There's one last trial yet to come. It will be the most terrible trial in all the world for you, unless you let our people go.
Originally a made-for-TV miniseries, Moses the Lawgiver was later released into theaters as simply Moses. Burt Lancaster had the title role. A recent film version of Exodus was an animated musical epic, The Prince of Egypt. Once the Hebrews reached the Promised Land, they found it already occupied, setting off a struggle that continues to this day. The Hebrews' problems in the Holy Land gave suitable grist for the movie mills, while idol-worshipping Philistines and other pagans provided villainy for both the Bible and Hollywood. The Book of Judges tells of these troubled times. From this book comes one of the greatest heroes as well as one of the greatest villainesses of the Bible. The super-strong Samson and the fatally seductive Delilah. Cecil B. DeMille had been planning a movie version of Samson and Delilah as early as 1935. A decade later, DeMille considered Burt Lancaster for the role of Samson, but instead picked Victor Mature after seeing the husky star in the film noir tale Force of Evil.
Samson, who alone and unafraid challenged and defeated the most dreaded army of his time. His daring exploits have become legend. The lion of the desert he fought with his bare hands. The orgies of barbaric pagans that roused his vengeful fury.
Best known for her then shocking nude scenes in Ecstasy, Hedy Lamarr played the alluring Delilah, seducing and destroying the Judean hero.
Daughter of hell.
I pulled the door open and there was this beautiful gal, holy Toledo. I couldn't believe it, and it was Hedy Lamarr right in the doorway.
DeMille had Delilah falling for Samson even as she betrays him to the Philistines.
Oh, that was a lot of fun. I had more fun with doing that picture. Me and our whole gang was in that, about 7 or 8 of us, and our job was to torture Samson in one of the arenas. I had a torch, and then we had another guy with the scissors, another guy with jaws, and anything to torture the poor soul. When he was tied up in the arena, the director said, closer to Samson. That meant us, So I got close as I could to Samson. I started really burning his feet, Of course, I didn't mean it. I just meant to tickle him, But then he used to say to me, you little monster, get away from there.
The finale brought down the house, or temple anyway. Samson and Delilah was the biggest hit of 1949, starting the trend of lavish biblical epics that carried on through the 60s. A hero of a different sort can be found in Judith of Bethulia, made in 1914. The story of Judith offered a heroine more along the lines of Delilah than Samson. It, too, emphasized the misnomer of the weaker sex. The tale of Judith is one of the more oddball stories from the Bible. It is neither in the Hebrew Bible nor in the Protestant Old Testament, but exists in the Catholic Apocrypha. In the story, the Hebrew city of Bethulia is besieged by the Assyrians, led by their general Holofernes. Judith of Bethulia was made by famed director D.W. Griffith, who acquired a reputation in the early years of the 20th century for making critically praised dramas. Griffith had long wanted to make a feature film on this scale, but his studio, American Biograph, insisted he produce only short movies. But when Griffith was sent to film in California, he bypassed studio management and secretly spent $18,000 on the production, an enormous amount at the time. In the film, Judith, a young widow, is moved by the plight of her fellow city folk suffering under the siege. Judith was played by one of the most popular leading ladies of the time, Blanche Sweet, just one of many stars discovered by Griffith. Determined to do her part for her city, Judith dons her finest apparel and goes forth to seduce the Assyrian general. Like Delilah, she vamps the stronger man, but her plans of cutting aren't limited to his hair. The sight of Holofernes minus his head proves bad for Assyrian morale. The soldiers panic and abandon the siege of the city. Judith of Bethulia became the precursor of the huge Hollywood biblical epics that were to follow. the story of Judith would be retold in 1960. Head of a Tyrant, an Italian production in the sword and sandal mode, starred Isabel Corey in the role of the female hero. In this version, Judith falls in love with the handsome Assyrian general Holofernes. But in the end, duty calls and the tryst is cut short, along with Holofernes. Romance rears its head in another movie based on a book of the Old Testament that also features a female hero. The 1960 film The Story of Ruth took many liberties with its source, the Book of Ruth. Elana Eden had the title role. In the Bible, Ruth is an ordinary Moabite woman who, after the death of her Israelite husband, marries the wealthy Hebrew farmer Boaz. Hollywood naturally wanted to spice things up a bit. In the movie, Ruth is a pagan Moabite priestess. She reconsiders her goals as a career woman after she falls in love and marries the handsome Hebrew Mahlon, played by Tom Tryon.
No. If Kara's not watching out for you, they'll find you and kill you. Go now, Malone. Go.
Idolatry and human sacrifice no longer have the same appeal to her.
We gave you shelter and sustenance, and you repaid us by attempting to corrupt a priestess.
I do not repent of my love for her, or for telling her of a God of justice.
We shall teach you something of justice.
Your people shall be my people. And your God, my God.
I love you, Ruth. I have loved you from the day we met in my field.
Despite the battle scenes and pagan rites, the film carried the simple theme that romance and faith are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Of course, Ruth turns out to be the great-grandmother of one of the Old Testament's greatest heroes, David. David and Goliath, an Italian movie made in 1961, cast Ivo Payer as the young shepherd turned hero. But it was Orson Welles who received top billing for playing King Saul. Welles was only on hand to pick up a check for appearing in the movie so he could afford to work on his own projects, which were always strapped for cash.
Samuel, of all in Israel, thou art beloved of the Lord.
Most of the film revolved around the power struggle and palace politics in the court of King Saul, who regards David as a threat to his throne, even though a potential savior of the kingdom. Meanwhile, the Philistines continue to behave like, well, Philistines. It all leads up to the best-known title bout in history, David versus Goliath. This is one of the most popular stories of the Bible, with its universal appeal of the little guy defeating the big bully.
Look at the sky, Goliath. The vultures augur ill for thee.
In the Bible, once the Philistines saw Goliath drop like a stone after being hit by a rock, they turned and fled. But Hollywood prefers a big battle scene, so in the movie they attack. Ultimately, the Israelites are victorious. In David and Bathsheba, made in 1951, Gregory Peck played King David after he had united his people into one kingdom, Israel. The story of his duel with Goliath is told in a flashback. Hollywood wasn't going to let that scene go to waste simply because it took place years earlier. But the king has an eye for beauty, supplied in this case by lovely Susan Hayward in the role of Bathsheba.
If the law of Moses is to be broken, David, let us break it in full understanding of what we want from each other.
David sends her husband to certain death so he can keep her for himself.
Has brought adultery and murder. She has brought the drought and the famine. She has brought the wrath of God.
You would force her to suffer the most horrible of deaths. Let the mob drive her like a dog through the streets to the city gates. Watch the cruel stones strike her flesh.
Yes, sir. If she had broken the law.
David must repent or see his kingdom suffer. Choices, choices. An epic of pageantry and romance, David and Bathsheba was Darryl F. Zanuck's and 20th Century Fox's response to DeMille's Samson and Delilah, released 2 years earlier. The 1985 film King David brought the biblical hero back to the big screen. Richard Gere was the controversial choice in the title role. The condemnations of the prophet Nathan were nothing compared to that of the movie critics, who lambasted the film despite a strong cast and more historically correct costuming and sets than used in the sprawling epics of the 50s.
I've seen you once before.
My lord, I'm married.
David and Bathsheba begat King Solomon, whose wisdom was renowned throughout the land.
Divide the child into 2 parts. Give half to the one woman, half to the other.
Oh, no!
The Bible mentions a queen of Sheba who, upon hearing tales of the glorious king, comes by to check him out, drop off some gifts, and then go home. But that's still enough to make a movie about it. Several, in fact. The 1921 movie The Queen of Sheba was based on the idea of a romance between Solomon and the visiting queen. The film had Betty Blythe in the title role. Blythe found herself rather scantily clad for a queen. She once commented that she had 28 costumes in the film, and if she wore all of them all at once, she still couldn't keep warm. At Sunday schools around America, children were forced to swear on the Bible not to see this scandalous picture with the half-naked Queen of Sheba. Sadly, no one can see this movie now. All prints of this epic film have been lost.
I shall lead my armies myself against Jerusalem.
The Italians came out with their own version of the story in 1953. The Queen of Sheba starred Leonora Ruffo as the scantily clad visiting queen who enjoyed her milk baths in Hollywood tradition. Add lots of battle scenes and you have a regular sword and sandal epic.
Here are the pagan orgies of Sheba's temple, the fabled treasures of Solomon's kingdom, the glory and slaughter of mammoth combat, in scenes of vastness and scope never achieved before.
Hollywood remade the story in 1959 as Solomon and Sheba. It was a big biblical epic in DeMillean style, in this case under the guiding hand of famed director King Vidor, making his last film. Originally, Tyrone Power was cast as King Solomon, but Power suffered a fatal heart attack shortly after the filming of a sword fight with his frequent on-screen rival, George Sanders. Many scenes had to be reshot with Power's replacement, Yul Brynner, wearing a wig to match Tyrone's hair. Power can still be seen in a number of scenes shot before his death. In this film version, the Queen of Sheba comes not in friendship, but as an agent provocateur sent by the Egyptian pharaoh to seduce Solomon.
I will sit at the feet of Solomon, like the wise men who flocked to Jerusalem. And perhaps I will learn from his own lips the way to destroy him.
She succeeds with her mission.
The Song of Solomon records, I am the rose of Sharon and the lily of the valleys. I am my beloved's, and his desire is toward me. I sat down under his shadow with great delight, and his fruit was sweet to my taste.
Gina Lollobrigida wore considerably more than Betty Blythe's Sheba, but her sumptuous gowns were low-cut enough to raise eyebrows and objections. Her liaison with Solomon incurred the wrath of the prophets, the Almighty, and the movie critics, but the only profits the studio was concerned about were at the box office. A biblical romance epic in the tradition of Samson and Delilah and David and Bathsheba, Solomon and Sheba reaped a bounty equal to Sheba's luxurious gifts. After the death of Solomon, things went downhill for the Israelites, whose land became divided into two kingdoms. Both were finally conquered by the Babylonians under King Nebuchadnezzar, who sacked Jerusalem and took the Hebrews into captivity. In the epic movie Intolerance, made in 1916, D.W. Griffith depicted man's inhumanity to man in several episodes set in different time periods. Among the ages covered was the fall of Babylon under the onslaught of the Persian Empire, led by Cyrus the Great. For the siege of Babylon, Griffith provided a spectacle on a scale never seen before or since. Cyrus is the villain in the film, but to the Jews, he was considered a liberator since he allowed them to return to their land and rebuild their temple in Jerusalem. But that wasn't the end of oppression. Persia now ruled Judea. The 1960 Italian-American co-production Esther and the King was based on another book of the Old Testament, the story of Esther. Richard Egan had the role of Persian King Ahasuerus, also called Xerxes. He wanted to replace his wife, Queen Vashti. In the biblical story of Esther, Queen Vashti angered her husband by refusing to appear at a feast to entertain his dinner guests.
Leave me. I would rather die a real death than lose you.
In Esther and the King, Queen Vashti angers the king by cheating on him and also by showing up at the feast and performing a striptease before his guests. This was considered much more cinematic than merely not showing up for supper. At least the dinner guests were entertained. But Hollywood had no trouble following the Bible with the Persian king's next move. He decides to hold a beauty contest to find a suitable replacement for his queen. Not waiting for volunteers, he sends out soldiers to round up contestants. Among those rounded up is Esther, a nice Jewish girl, who was abducted from her wedding by the Persian king's soldiers and forcibly brought to the Persian capital. Esther was played by none other than Joan Collins. Famed director Raoul Walsh helmed this production, which he also co-wrote, and Mario Bava was the cinematographer.
You may go.
To the surprise of no one but the cast, Esther wins the beauty contest.
Wait.
She gets crowned Queen of the pageant as well as of the Persian Empire.
That face of light. I remember.
Esther uses her position to thwart a conspiracy to massacre the Hebrews. She also falls in love with the king. Let's hear it for Esther. They go on to found a dynasty. No, not that dynasty. For the Jews, the blows kept coming. They still had their troubles and their oppressors. Much of the remainder of the Old Testament deals with the Babylonian exile or the corruption and sinfulness of the people of Israel who were blamed for causing their problems. Most of the apocalyptic books of the Old Testament were written during this period. After the Persians came the Greeks, then the Romans. Helpless against the might of Rome, the Jews prayed for a Messiah to save them. According to some sources, they got one.